complex chapters in Tanya. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter. It'll be a deep dive into some elements of Chassidus. Okay, so we're going to finish sort of a subject matter today. A few weeks ago, well, by now a few months ago, we asked the question.
Last year.
Right. Before we start, you're here. In the world, today is a day to stay home and not do anything. And you decided to get out of bed, or you may have been out of bed to get out of the house, and come here to participate in a Torah class. What happens if you're in the middle of learning and your child starts crying? Should you stop and go to the child or continue learning?
I think you have to probably take care of the child.
Take care of the child. Why?
Maybe he has some needs, he or she has some needs that need to be taken care of.
Okay.
Depending on the age.
So if you remember, the way we started the last two chapters was with a general observation that almost every moment of our lives, in one way or another, we're making a decision between two things. We're at work 9 to 5, hopefully not every minute from 9 to 5, but many times we're consciously deciding, I'd much rather be doing something with someone, whatever, but I'm choosing to be here. Yeah. When I go to sleep at night, I'd much rather stay up and have a good time, but I'm choosing to when I wake up in the morning, I'd much rather continue sleeping. But almost every moment of the day, we're making a choice between two things. How do we know how to make the right choice or what the right choice is? So the way we laid it out was, if you have a purpose in life, if you have a goal, an objective of what you're trying to accomplish, then that will help you make all of these decisions along the way. And you see that with people that are very purposeful, very mission-oriented. They make, sometimes to an extreme, but they make decisions to advance their mission statement, their objective, their goal. Now that we've finished these two chapters, that basically, as we'll summarize soon, laid down the groundwork of the purpose of why we're here and what we're supposed to do and what the purpose of the whole world is. So now we're going to answer the big question. But first, we're going to answer this small question we just asked. What's more important, to continue studying Torah or take care of the child? Last week, we discussed that there's, in Torah and mitzvah, and in tzedakah, or mitzvahs in general, there's something that the other doesn't have, right? That when you do a mitzvah, you're impacting the physical body, the body of the person, which studying Torah doesn't do. But studying Torah alters the mind, changes the perception, which doing a mitzvah doesn't necessarily do, right? Now we're going to get to a deeper distinction between Torah and mitzvahs, not as much on its impact on the person, but more on, not relationship, where do you meet God more? So if we're talking about the person, what impacts me more? Studying Torah, doing mitzvahs? What do you think? What would impact me more? That would impact me more? I would think, no. For God, we said that to fulfill God's purpose, doing a mitzvah. But when you do a mitzvah, your fulfillment, your enjoyment, your betterment, whatever it is, when you stop and do a mitzvah, okay, that has an impact. But when you study something, you change the way you see something, that has a tremendous impact on you, right? Mm-hmm. So, in the impact, the question is, where do you find God more? In Torah or in mitzvahs? Okay, so there are 248 positive mitzvahs, right? We've discussed that they represent the 248 limbs in the body, but they also represent 248 limbs in God. That's how Kabbalah, for obviously God doesn't have limbs, but 248 elements, and each mitzvah is a desire, one of 248 desires that God has, wills that he wants us to do, wills us to do. And so when we do a mitzvah, we're doing God's will. But when we study the Torah, okay, before we get there, where's our soul? In our mind or in our body?
We talk about an animal soul and godly soul. I
Yeah.
think it's internalized. I guess.
But even the animal soul is a soul. It's right. It's the life of the person. The soul is found in every limb. You rip your toenail a little too much, you scream from pain. That's your soul. It's not your body. Take someone in the grave and rip their toenail, nothing's gonna happen. Don't do that. It's desecrating your body. No, don't do it. But they're not going to scream. The soul's in the toenail. But where do you see the soul? Where do you encounter the soul more? That's in the mind. When you see someone's hand, you don't see their soul. You can't identify anything about their soul. When you see their mind, in other words, when they share with you what's on their mind, but body expression is a way of expressing what the soul is thinking. So the soul can't be expressed in every limb. The soul is found in every limb. But we all understand that although the soul is found in every limb, when you encounter the mind, there you're going to get in touch with the soul. So when we do a mitzvah, Torah is the soul, so to speak, of the mitzvah. The Torah tells us why to do the mitzvah most of the times. What God's thinking in this mitzvah. But it's not doing the mitzvah. When you do the mitzvah, then you're actually doing God's will. You're encountering the limbs, so to speak. But if you want to encounter God himself, you got to study the Torah, right? God introduced himself at the giving of the Torah with a Greek word for I. He didn't say ani. Ani is Hebrew for I. It says anochi. Anochi is an acronym for 4 Hebrew words. Anna, or it's Aramaic actually, but you could say Anna nafshi, I, my soul, kitavit, I wrote it, yehavit, and giving it. In other words, God's saying, I wrote myself into the Torah, and I'm giving it to you. Where do we see this revelation of godliness in the Torah? So when we study Chassidus or Kabbalah or Medrash, there you see it clear, right? But even when you study Jewish law, where do you see God's will in Jewish law? But Alter Rebbe already made this comparison, and he's going to say it again, that Torah is like water. Water flows down from high places to low. It's always constantly trying to get lower places, but it's the same water that was up there and that's down here. So the Torah is God's intellect, knowledge that comes down. Obviously, the way we read it is different than the way it's up there in its expression, but it's the same thing. It's like what? It's God's knowledge, God's wisdom that's in the Torah. So where do we encounter God more? In the Torah. Okay, let's continue here. We are on page 519. Yeah. So we were just talking about how Torah is equal to all the mitzvahs, right? First we said that tzedakah is equal to all the mitzvahs, then we said Torah is equal to all the mitzvahs, right? So now we're continuing. Another advantage in Torah. Aside from this, there is another, what was this? That Torah's effect on the person is much more internal than mitzvahs. That was the first advantage. Aside from this, there is another far more important aspect to the superiority of Torah study over all other mitzvot, based on the statement quoted above in chapter 23 from Tikkunei Zohar, that the 248 positive commandments are the 248 limbs of the king, in other words, of God. Just as, for example, in the case of a human being, the vitality, in other words, the soul, in his 248 8 organs bears no comparison or similarity to the vitality in his brain. In other words, the intellect, which is divided into 3 faculties, Chachma, Bina, and Das. So even though there is a soul in every limb, you can't compare the soul in the toenail or in the finger to the soul that's in the brain. Just as it is in the case of a human being, so too by way of analogy, allowing for the qualification, obviously, that any comparison between human and divine traits must be distant. However, by myriads of degrees, there has to be some similarity, right? Because we're created in the image of God. So it is with same thing by way of analogy is it with regard to the illumination of the Ein Sof light, clothed in mitzvot of action, that it's much less in compared to the illumination of the Ein Sof light clothed in the Chabad faculties of one who is immersed in the wisdom of Torah. An illumination commensurate with the level of each man's intellect and his grasp of Torah. In other words, to the extent that his intellect grasps the Torah which he studies, it is united with godliness with a unity comparable to that of one's intellect with its soul. And although one grasps Torah only as it is clothed in physical terms, right? We don't learn God isn't thinking about an ox goring a cow, right? So we're obviously not reading the same words. So although one grasps Torah only as it is clothed in physical terms, for example, the law concerning 2 men who clutch a garment, or one who trades a cow for a donkey, how then can it be said that through Torah's study of such laws, in other words, not studying Kabbalah and godliness, studying laws of how to live my daily life, how can we say that one attains this lofty level of unity with godliness? Yet, the Torah has been likened to water descending from a high place. The water on the lower level is exactly the same as it was on the higher level. Similarly, the laws of Torah, although they have descended to deal with ordinary physical situations, still consist of God's will and wisdom. Thus, in studying Torah, one is united with God's will and wisdom, and thereby with God himself, as explained above in chapter 4. Even when you're studying things, trivial things of mundane life. I already made a bracha. Okay, back from Rabbi Gordon, so no one sees him. Sometimes he'll say, I already made a bracha.
He always says that, yeah.
Sometimes makes a bracha, but then sometimes.
Right.
Okay. Before we continue to the next piece, the Alter Rebbe, author of the Tanya, raised his grandson, the third Chabad Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek, as his mother died when he was 2 years old. And so he was once sitting on his grandfather's lap, and he was playing with his grandfather's beard. So Alter Rebbe asked him, no, sorry, as he was playing with his beard, he said, "Oh, here's this is Zaidi." So the Alter Rebbe said, "No, that's Zaidi's beard." So he pointed to the Alter Rebbe's heart. There's Zaidi. He said, "No, it's Alter Rebbe's heart." There's no pointed at everyone. The Alter Rebbe said, "No, that's okay." Slowly he snuck off, and he hid behind the door, and then he made as if he heard himself, and he screamed, "Zaidi!" So the Alter Rebbe turned around and said, "What happened?" So he said, "There's Zaidi." In other words, yeah, this is Zaidi. It's part of Zaidi. But what's Zaidi? It's the part that hears the child cry, not the physical ear, but what's inside between the ears that hears the child's cry. Okay, till now, we've spoken about Torah and mitzvahs as 2 separate things. Torah affects me in a way greater than mitzvahs. Mitzvahs affect the world in a way greater than Torah, and therefore they each do something different. What happens when they clash? What happens if I have to choose between the two? So obviously, we try as much as possible, they shouldn't clash. We set aside time for Torah and time for mitzvahs. What happens if they do? So someone, I don't know, he's getting ready for Sukkot, he's studying the laws of Sukkot, and it's Erev Sukkot, and he hasn't put up a Sukkah yet. The guy has to put up a Sukkah. Is he supposed to stop studying Torah to put up a Sukkah? Yeah, probably. He's studying about tzedakah, and a poor man knocks on the door and says he's hungry. Do you have to stop studying to feed him? Sure. Probably, right? But how do we know? How do we know what pushes away what? And when? because each one has something that the other one doesn't. Each one has a quality that makes it greater than all the rest put together, right? So usually, whatever's greater pushes the other one away. Like, for example, if you have um, a baby, they're born on Shabbos, the eighth day, the baby boy. The eighth day is on Shabbos. So there's a mitzvah, positive mitzvah to do a bris. There's a negative mitzvah not to let blood on Shabbos. So what do? You have the bris. Why?
Because it supersedes Shabbat.
Or why?
So
Oh, so the Alter Rebbe learns from here that a positive mitzvah is greater than a negative mitzvah. Okay? In other words, if it's greater, it pushes away what's less. But what's greater? Studying Torah, doing mitzvahs. We know they each have a quality, but which one is greater? Which one pushes away the other one?
they're both positive.
Yeah. Or the Torah has another element of it that rises above mitzvahs. But it's not, yeah. Torah is not one of the 248 limbs. By the way, in Mishnah, where it lists 248 limbs, the brain isn't one of them. Because it only lists the limbs that have meat and bones. However, there are other places where the brain is considered a limb in purity and impurity. So, but it's interesting that when we do this thing where the mitzvahs are the 200, so although there's a mitzvah to study Torah, but Torah isn't one of the limbs. Torah is it's the soul, right? So does that mean it's greater? What we said before, tzedakah is greater even than studying Torah.
248.
So this is an age-old discussion in the Talmud. There was a argument amongst the sages, which one's greater, Talmud or Maaseh? Is action greater or is Talmud greater? And they went back and forth. You know what they decided? No. They said Talmud is greater. Why? Because it leads to action. You can't do anything if you don't know what to do. Okay, so Talmud's greater. That means you should learn. Learning always supersedes a mitzvah. If you're learning about tzedakah and a poor man knocks on your door, you shouldn't stop learning to give him tzedakah. Because you're learning. If you're not learning, then you have to deal with it. But if you're learning, that's greater. However, there's another conversation in the Talmud where the Talmud gets into this discussion, and the Talmud seems to imply that because Talmud is greater, therefore it should push away. And the conclusion in the Talmud there is that it's different. Is that it depends. If the action is something that could be done by someone else, then you shouldn't stop studying to do the action. So if you're home and your wife is home and she could feed the poor, then you shouldn't stop studying Torah. But if your wife isn't home, and if you don't answer the door, no one's going to answer the door, then you stop to answer the door. But wait, if one's greater, it pushes away the other? How can you have this in between where sometimes Talmud's greater, sometimes mitzvah's greater? How do we know how to make decisions? We have to know what the hierarchy is to know how to make decisions in life. Yeah. So, from God's perspective, as you mentioned at the beginning, action is great. Because what's the purpose of the entire creation and the whole purpose of me being in this world? My soul doesn't need to gain anything. What's the purpose of my soul coming down to this world and this whole creation? To make the world a dwelling place for God. And how is that accomplished? Through action. Actionable mitzvahs. However, the only way to transform the world through action is if you study Torah, is if you know why you're doing those actions. Right? If I eat and I don't have a divine intention, then my eating isn't elevating the food. If I do have a divine intention, then it is elevating the. So if I just do and never study and therefore never have divine intentions, I'm not really doing anything. But you could study all you want for 100 years. If you study for 100 years, you don't do mitzvahs, there's no way you can make up those 100 years. However, if you do mitzvahs for 100 years and then you study after 100 years, you can elevate all of those mitzvahs. Why? Because action at the end of the day, that's what accomplishes it. If you build a house and mindlessly even if it didn't turn out as you expected, and you have to repair this, that, and the other. At the end of the day, the house is built. You have shelter. But if you draw plans for 50 years and don't actually call a contractor or pick up a hammer and put in a nail, you've got no house. Therefore, when the sages said Talmud is greater, why did they say it's greater? Because it leads to action. So really, what's greater? The action's greater. But you can't have action without knowing, so therefore you have to learn. So therefore, if the action can be done by someone else, then why do you have to do it? What's greater for your soul? To study Torah or to do mitzvahs? To study Torah. What's greater for God's purpose is to do mitzvahs. But if there's someone else in the house that can take care of the poor person, why should you stop? Someone else will do it. You won't get the mitzvah. Okay, you won't get the mitzvah, but you're studying Torah.
So isn't it like when they Israel and they said that's not what you plan, we will do?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. 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 However, we can't forget about study. In other words, there has to be very strong emphasis on action, obviously, because that's what accomplishes everything. But we can't forget why we're doing the action, what the whole purpose is.
So if you do the study about it, then you said then you can elevate it.
Yeah. Well, the best is to grow, to study and do, and the older you get, the more mature you get, it comes together. But assuming we're not you starting from somewhere, and assuming you what should I do? This or that. So action has to be done. Now, some people won't do it. Again, some people, if you don't come to the Torah class, you won't know what action to do. If you don't come to a class about Shabbos, you're not going to know what to do. Or about the holidays. It's like, right? You're not going to know what to do. So obviously we have to study to know. Okay. Um, there's a famous story of the Alter Rebbe that the Rebbe repeated a number of times that Yom Kippur, in the middle of davening, he once took off his talus and his kittel, and he left the shul, and he went to the edge of town. There was a house there with a woman who had just given birth, and he cut wood and made a fire and cooked for her to warm her up and to feed her because she was in danger. Her giving birth is a life-threatening thing. So the Rebbe spoke many times of why the Alter Rebbe did it himself. Why you send someone else? He's sitting in the middle of davening. He has this divine inspiration. How's he supposed to know somehow he knows there's this woman that needs help. Her family left her. Why didn't they take it? Whatever, they left. Why didn't Alter Rebbe just turn to his attendant or one of his chassidim and say, go take care of this woman? So it says in the Talmud that when it comes to desecrating the Shabbos for saving a life, mitzvah begadol. If you're in a shul and people start asking, are we allowed to call 911 for this person who just fell on the floor and isn't responding? Mitzvah begadol. The rabbi should pick up the phone and call 911. No one should get should get the idea that maybe we should try to find someone else when someone's laying on the floor and needs 911. Mitzvah. And the Rebbe said, Alter Rebbe looked around, didn't see anyone more gadol than him. So he went himself. But does that mean that a husband should leave his wife so that the Alter Rebbe should go and no, the husband should stay, obviously. But when you're in a situation where someone has to, so this is a mitzvah that could be done by someone else, but the Talmud says in this case, you do it to show that you're supposed to do this. This is where you see that although the Alter Rebbe for himself probably would have accomplished more if you'd have stayed in the shul in Yom Kippur. And yet, when it comes to a mitzvah, this is how we make the world. This is how we fulfill God's purpose.
It was on Shabbat. Yeah.
Oh, so you have to call the
Rabbi Zofsky, he jumped down from FEMA and he told his son Ben Sion, it's also rabbi, it's called 911.
yeah.
Yeah. And lucky that, well, they had a doctor there who was working on it.
See, if there's a non-Jew there, you can, and it won't take an extra second.
Right.
It's not if there's a non-Jew that could drive to the hospital or there's no mitzvah that you should. But if we're talking about if there's no other Jews there, then you should, just because someone is not as rabbinical as you, that doesn't give you a right. They have the same obligation for Shabbos. A non-Jew is preferable. We once had someone that they collapsed. They had to be taken to the hospital. So there was someone who wasn't Jewish, and they drove him to the hospital. Um, but yeah. Anyhow, okay. So middle of 521. Yeah.
Mhm.
Nevertheless, in other words, notwithstanding the superior level of unity with godliness attained only by Torah, our sages have said the essential thing is not study but deed. It is also written this day. In other words, during our life in this world, the all important thing is to do them. In other words, the mitzvahs. And the halacha rules that one must interrupt Torah study to perform a mitzvah of action when it cannot be fulfilled by others. We just got finished saying how great Torah is, and you can't have a unity with God in mitzvahs like you do with Torah. For this, the active performance of mitzvahs is man's entire purpose, the purpose for which he was created and for which his soul descended to this world, so that God may have an abode precisely in the lowest realms, to turn the darkness of this world into light of holiness, so that God's glory fill specifically the entire physical world, and all flesh will behold godliness together, as was discussed above in chapter 36. In other words, when the mission statement is clear that the whole purpose of my life is to make this world a dwelling place for God, my Torah study can't come at that expense. If the world can become a dwelling place without me, I have to study. But if not, I can't study for my own personal gain. Now, we have to study to know how to make the world. That the Talmud says, the Talmud comes first. That's why children, for the majority of the time, and even young, till 18 or till you get married, 99% of your day is filled with Torah study. Because without that, you're not going to know how to live your life. You're not going to know how to make the world a dwelling place. That's why the Talmud's conclusion is Talmud is greater. Once you're in the world, you have to study because it's a mitzvah to study, but it can't come at the expense of making the world a dwelling place for God, because that's the whole purpose. No, that's the mission statement. On the other hand, if the mitzvah can be performed by others, one does not interrupt Torah study to perform it, even though the whole Torah is, after all, only an explanation of the mitzvahs of action. So why not? Why shouldn't we stop learning if someone else could do the mitzvah? This is because the Torah is the level of Chabad of the Blessed Ein Sof. And hence, when one is engaged in studying it, he draws upon himself an infinitely greater illumination of the Blessed Ein Sof, greater both in its illuminative power and in its higher quality than the illumination and influence that one draws upon his soul through mitzvahs, which are merely organs of the king. So you can never accomplish with a mitzvah what you accomplish with Torah study. In your own personal life, you're connecting with God in a much deeper, much more impactful way with studying Torah. So if the mitzvah could be done by someone else, why would you stop? This is what Rav Sheshes meant when he said, "Rejoice, my soul, for you do I study scripture, for you do I study Mishnah," as explained elsewhere at length. In other words, he studies for himself, but for God, he does mitzvahs. So wherever you have to tefillin, I can't put on tefillin for you, so you have to put on tefillin. The Torah doesn't give you an exemption to study instead of putting on tefillin. But the Torah didn't say you have to feed this poor person. The Torah said this poor person has to be fed. Why do you have to be the one to do it? Okay, if you're the only one around, then you got to do it. But if you're not the only one around, we actually mentioned the story elsewhere in Tanya. There was a rich person and he was traveling and he had a wagon driver and they got stuck in a town for Shabbos. And the wealthy person he gets ready for Shabbos in his hotel. He goes to shul early. He's gonna say Tehillim or whatever. And on the way, he sees a wagon stuck in the mud, and the wagon driver is asking him for help. So he doesn't know anything about wagons, but a Jew needs help, so he stops and helps. But he doesn't know a thing about wagons or horses, and he gets all muddy and bruised up because the horse kicks him, and then he goes back to the hotel to change right before Shabbos. He comes to shul, and is ready Shabbos. What happened in the meantime? The wagon driver also got ready for Shabbos, went to shul. He comes first one to shul. There's a whole bunch of beggars there. He invites them all to his house, to his apartment for Shabbos. He barely has food for himself, but he wants to host. There's poor people there. Meanwhile, the rich person comes to shul. All the poor people already have where to go. He has, meanwhile, a feast in his apartment, in his hotel room. So he doesn't end up helping the wagon driver get the horse out of the mud. he doesn't invite anyone for Shabbos. Meanwhile, the wagon driver, he invites everyone but can't feed them. He didn't. So this is an example that's brought in Chassidus. When these souls came to heaven, they were called the wandering soul. They got confused. They had to come back down to fulfill their purpose in life. In other words, when it's clear what we're supposed to do, if we're not good at it, why do it? But if there's no one else to do it, then get involved or hire someone or find someone. But before we finish here, there's another story with Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's successor was his son, the Mittel Rebbe, his oldest son, and then after that was his grandson, Menachem Mendel, who was not the second Rebbe's son, but his son-in-law. He married his first cousin, but he was anyhow. So the Alter Rebbe lived in the same house as his son, the Mittel Rebbe, and in the Mittel Rebbe's room there was a baby sleeping, and it was the middle of the night, and he was studying. The Alter Rebbe was either on the second floor or on the lower floor, a different floor, I think, and or in a different room. And in the middle of the night, the baby rolled out of his bed and started crying. The Mittel Rebbe was so engrossed in his study that he didn't hear the baby crying. Alter Rebbe, who was on a different floor in a different room, heard the baby crying, came and put the baby back to sleep. In the morning, he bumped into his son, and he said, "This is not the way. No matter what world you're in, no matter how deeply you're studying, when a baby cries, you have to hear the baby crying and go tend to the baby's needs." Now, obviously, the Alter Rebbe was there, but the Alter Rebbe wasn't in the room. Who was in the room? Okay. Now we spoke about the conflict sort of between the higher and the lower, right? The upper and the lower, the Torah and the mitzvah. Alter Rebbe is going to finish here that there's another conflict within the upper itself, what seems to be upper. In the three pillars upon which the world stands, you ever heard of the three pillars? It says in Ethics of Our Fathers, right? Torah, avoda means service, and acts of kindness, acts of generosity. In other words, Torah, mitzvahs, what's avoda, what's service?
You think service when you think of temple service, but
So the commentary says it refers to prayer. What about Torah and prayer? Which one is greater? Does one push off the other, or are they equal?
I would say they would be equal, because a lot of the prayers are Sukkim taken from the Torah.
Okay. However, I'll suggest that almost the same difference between Torah and mitzvahs we find, and obviously a loftier way between Torah and prayer. Where do you experience personally, where do you feel godliness more? Where do you feel a connection to God more? Torah or prayer? Feeling means emotional.
I feel when I'm down.
When you're davening more. Why? Because the whole purpose of davening is to create this love, this awe, this bond, this connection with God. When you're studying Torah, you make a blessing before. Hopefully, you're thinking about God, but you can't be thinking about God while you're studying. Otherwise, you're not studying. You can't be thinking about two things at the same time. But just like the difference in Torah and mitzvahs, where Torah is my personal gain, whereas mitzvah, because mitzvahs is where I'm doing what God wants. Here, prayer, I might feel God more. But where am I actually encountering God more? In Torah. Prayer, I'm only getting in touch with my feelings, my desire to connect to God. But it's all limited to what I feel. Let's say one day I don't feel anything. But when you're studying Torah, you're studying God's wisdom, whether you're aware of it or not. You're literally connecting to God, whether you're aware of it or not. So therefore, in sort of the conflict, if there's a conflict between Torah and prayer, Torah supersedes. Now, in days of old, when there were people that dedicated their lives to Torah to the extent that they had no time for anything else, this is referred to in Jewish law as Torato Umnato. Torah is his profession. To the extent he doesn't have time for anything else, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't even get married. He said he can't. He has no time. He has no. Such a person wouldn't stop to pray. He would stop to say the first verse of Shema, because that's a mitzvah, but he wouldn't stop his Torah study to pray. He didn't have to pray. Today, that doesn't exist. Even the greatest Torah scholars today do other things. If you're doing other things, you got to stop. You got to pray also. But in essence, if there is a conflict between Torah and prayer, the Torah supersedes. Again, because Torah has this advantage. We're in a mitzvah where you're doing what God told you to do. So then you can't study Torah to avoid the mitzvah. But prayer, no. There is a mitzvah of prayer too, but the biblical mitzvah of prayer isn't the way we do it. Not every time we pray, we're doing a biblical mitzvah of prayer, but there's no biblical obligation to pray 3 times a day. If you pray 10 times a day, you did the mitzvah, biblical mitzvah of prayer 10 times. But there isn't a mitzvah to pray 10 times. Just like, yeah, if you put up 30 mezuzahs, you did 30 mitzvahs. But there isn't a mitzvah to put up 30 mezuzahs, right? Right? So there isn't a mitzvah to eat kosher meat. But if you do, you got to slaughter it. So there isn't a mitzvah to pray every day 3 times. But the rabbi set it up. But every time you pray, you're doing a biblical mitzvah because there's a biblical mitzvah to pray. There's a dispute whether there's a mitzvah to pray every day, once, or there's a mitzvah to pray when you need. When you need something, you pray. So we're worried people are going to forget to pray when they need something. So, and that's why the rabbis included all a person's needs within the Amidah. So we don't forget about that. But technically, Torah supersedes prayer. Because Torah, again, is where you're accessing God himself. Whereas prayer is you're getting in touch with your feelings to God. Okay, let's see this. 524. This influence and illumination generated by one's Torah study, which man draws from the radiance of the Ein Sof light upon his soul and upon the souls of all Israel, meaning, as will be explained later, that the light is drawn into the spiritual level known as the Shekhinah, or Knesset Yisrael, the source of all the souls of Israel. And thereby the Ein Sof light reaches not only the soul of the person studying Torah, but also that of every Jew. So this illumination, which one draws through this Torah study, is referred to as calling. As in Talmudic expression concerning a Torah student, usually translated as one who reads Torah, korei b'Torah, but reinterpreted here as one who calls God through the Torah. Kriya, right? We say the Baal Korei. What usually when you say a Kriya, what does that mean? A reading?
Yeah.
It also means calling.
Kriya Shema, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a reading of Shema, but Vayikra Hashem al Moshe. God called out to Moshe. Yeah? So this phrase means that in Torah study, one calls God to come to him, so to speak. As a man calls to his friend to come to him, or as a child will call his father to come and join him and not to part from him, leaving him alone, God forbid. This is the meaning of the verse. God is near to all who call him, in truth, right? We say this in the Ashrei. And there is no truth but Torah, indicating that one calls God with truth. How do you call out to God? Through Torah. As opposed to simply calling God, only calling God through Torah study. As opposed to simply calling God, how do you call God through truth, through Torah? In contrast, the one who does not call him through Torah study, but merely cries, Father, Father. Oh, in other words, prayer. Someone who only prays, only calls out to God, but doesn't attach himself to God, that's not calling God with truth. Now, will God answer? Perhaps. Mm-hmm. But the verse says God will answer all who call. God is near to all who call him. All who call him in truth, through Torah. Over he who thus calls God, the prophet laments. Over he who thus calls God, in other words, someone who just calls God, not through Torah, the prophet laments, there is none who calls by your name, as explained elsewhere. By dwelling on this matter, intelligent person will derive means of drawing upon himself a great awe of God, when he engages in Torah study, as explained above, that when you realize when you're studying Torah, you're literally studying God. Wait, and I'm sitting here like this. I'm laying in bed, or I'm doing something else in the meantime. Okay. But before I conclude, before I summarize everything we've done up until now, just another story. So we had a story of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittel Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek. Now let's skip the Tzemach Tzedek's grandson, the Rebbe Rashab. He was the fifth Chabad Rebbe, and the Rebbe Maharash of Shmuel. He was the Tzemach Tzedek's son, youngest son, and his son was the Rebbe Rashab. He was his middle son. And then the Rebbe Rashab had an only son, was the previous Rebbe, and the previous Rebbe only had daughters, and his son-in-law was the Rebbe. So the Rebbe Rashab had a study partner, a chassid he used to study with. And in those days, they didn't have many rooms in the house. And in his study was the child's, the previous Rebbe, when he was a baby, was sleeping. In the middle of studying, somehow, he was known as the Poltava Rav. He was the Rav of Poltava. He was the Alter Rebbe's study partner. And in the middle, he started speaking about the way the previous Rebbe looked as a baby, that you could see the purity of his thought. So the Rebbe Rashab said, later he told the previous Rebbe that at that moment he had a big desire to kiss him. He was in the middle of sleeping. And he decided that just like in the temple, you brought sacrifices, but sometimes instead of, which is like a kiss, instead of sacrifices, you would substitute it with bringing things for the temple, bedek habayis. So you bring money, bring whatever donate whatever you want to the temple, not just instead of a sacrifice. So he decided to substitute the kiss with writing a Hasidic discourse. And he sat down and he wrote a Hasidic discourse. When the previous Rebbe turned 12 on his 12th birthday, his father gifted him this Hasidic discourse. And he told him, this is a Hasidic kiss, and one day I'll explain to you what that means. And on his 16th birthday, he told him the story of what it. What's the difference between a regular kiss and a Hasidic kiss? So the fifth Rebbe, I don't know if it was on his deathbed, but right before he passed, he turned to his son and he said in Yiddish, Ich gehe in Himmel. You know what that means? I'm going to heaven. Und die Ksovim los ich eich. I'm leaving you my writings. What does that mean? The Rebbe spoke about this many, many times. We said before, Anochi is an acronym for God writing himself into Torah. And it says in the Talmud that anytime you read something from someone else, that person's lips are moving in their grave. And therefore, when you read Torah, it's as if God's lips are moving. You know, is God studying Torah every time you're studying Torah with him? The Rebbe Rashab was saying that I wrote myself into the writings. What type of comfort it is? What type of comfort is it? I'm dying, but I'm leaving you my writings. That's a comfort. Yeah, if my essence is in my writings, then yeah, sure, it's gonna be sad and you're gonna be missing the physical connection, but you still have me. So what's a Hasidic kiss? A regular kiss is an action, it doesn't stay. Baby will never remember it. A Hasidic kiss is when you connect. What's a kiss? Kiss is a connection. When you connect your essence with the other person. This is Torah. Torah is God's neshama, so to speak, his intellect, his neshama given to us. And when we study Torah, we become one with that. So there's a tremendous advantage of studying Torah over doing any other mitzvah. But at the same time, that's not why we were created. Moshe needed to spend his life studying Torah because he needed to teach Torah. I'm not saying every person was created for that reason. There are some tzaddikim. But 99% of us were created to do mitzvahs, not to spend our lives studying Torah. Yes, there are Jews who have to spend their lives in kollel. There are rabbis who have to dedicate their lives to Torah. Otherwise, the other people won't know what to do. But that doesn't make it the purpose of creation. The purpose of creation was the people going to work 9 to 5, 6 days a week. They're trying to catch a few minutes of Torah study in their free time here and there. That's the reason the world was created. So, when it comes to a conflict between our body and our soul in olden times, they felt that the body got in the way of the soul connecting to God. So they would torture the body, they would fast, they would. So this teaches us not so. Sure, every once in a while a person might need it, but generally speaking, the body, this is why you were created, to turn the body into a tool for God. Don't break it. Learning versus doing. We'll learn the next few chapters, kavana and action, intent and action. We're going to get more into that later. Studying Torah all my life or going to the business. The average person has to go into business, has to go work. Tzaddik versus a Beinoni. Who is the world created for? Tzaddikim or Beinonim? A Beinoni. Sure, we need tzaddikim. Just like if you go to work, you need to support Torah, people that study Torah, because we need the Torah. Otherwise, we don't have our work is nothing. But why was the world created? For the Beinonim, for the strugglers, for the people that go to work 9 to 5, for the body, for the action. That's why the world was created. As long as we keep that front and center, as long as we were so let's go back to the where, what, who, and when. What's the purpose of creation? To make this world, the physical world, a dwelling place. Anything physical, the more physical it is, the more we have to, unless it's forbidden. There, God said, don't touch it. When will this happen? So we discussed last chapter. This will be realized when Moshiach comes. That's when it's going to be fulfilled. We're working towards that. How do we do this? Through doing mitzvahs. When we do a mitzvah, we elevate the object we do the mitzvah with. We elevate the body that's doing the mitzvah. We elevate our food that we eat, and the work, that the money that went into that, and everything ultimately goes into being elevated to doing the mitzvah. And who does this? Every Jew, through doing the 613 commandments, right? And just like everything supports the mitzvah, even the food we eat and the money we make, all the non-Jews and every other part of the world is all there to support. It's all funneling down into getting to this end game, which is when Mashiach comes. And the whole world becomes a dwelling place for God. So that's really the last 2 chapters. That was the purpose, the mission statement for creation. To know, anytime we're faced with a question in life, what should I do now? We know the mission statement, it becomes a very easy choice. Next few chapters, we'll get into kavana. We've brought it up a number of times, and now we'll deal with it. I even managed to finish it early. I was worried I wouldn't even finish it.
No,
Any questions?
well, Kamana is more